Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Minnesota. On May 25th, George Floyd's death brought an unprecedented urgency to the conversation around police reform and community safety. It brought issues of racial equity and police accountability into sharp focus for Minnesotans across the state, across the country, and across the world. But that was not the beginning of this fight that led us here to today. George Floyd's death followed decades of advocacy by communities of color and indigenous communities. It followed decades of marches, petitions, grassroots organizing, and awareness campaigns. This is an issue that strikes at the heart of questions that parents have to ask in communities of color. Do we feel protected in our own communities by law enforcement? Will I be treated differently by people because of the color of my skin? This group of lawmakers here responded by putting together a piece of meaningful legislation that will impact our communities in a positive way. Every single person, every single Minnesotan deserves to feel safe and protected in their communities. This bipartisan piece of legislation moves us towards a critical step towards criminal justice reform. These critical reforms are long overdue. They are meant to strengthen transparency and community oversight. They do some things that I think many thought were already the law. They ban chokeholds and warrior training and expand de-escalation training for our officers. But we understand this is only a beginning. I'm proud that Minnesota is taking these steps, and I'm proud now to sign these measures into law. We will hear from the people who did the hard work on this. We will hear from legislators who have worked on this their entire professional careers and in their legislative careers, and brought together groups of people who needed to be at that table from various different perspectives, but all with a common goal of those very simple things of human dignity, of civil rights, of the sense of security in your community, and the sense of equity and fairness that all of us know that's the true measure of what we are as a state and who we are as a people. So at this time, I'm glad to sign this piece of legislation into law. The work doesn't end today. We're having this conversation because the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus members you see before you fought for this. They brought people to the table and worked with law enforcement, worked with our communities, worked with families who had experienced this. And let me be clear, we're here very simply because of their leadership and because of their determination to get this done. Before I turn it over to the Lieutenant Governor, I'd like to take a moment. We're gonna, between the two of us, make sure that we call out the names and thank folks. And I recognize we're going to leave folks. There's names out there that many of you might not hear that I have gotten to know because of the loss of their family members. People like Amity and Valerie, Tushira, Delshia, names that I know now as friends and family members. So you're going to hear a list of names, but please know there are countless others and many who aren't in the public's light, but are there at marches, are there at city council meetings, are there organizing for this change. But I'd like to personally thank Representative Rena Moran for the work that she's done, Public Safety Chair Carlos Mariani, Commissioner John Harrington, Speaker Melissa Hortman, Senator Jeff Hayden, Senator Kerry Dietzig, Representative Ruth Richardson, Representative Cooley Herr, Senator Susan Kent, Mike Howard, Jamie Long, Dave Pinto, Kerry Moeller, representatives who worked on this. Lieutenant Governor will talk about those members of the POCI Caucus. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to Dakota County Sheriff Tim Leslie and Blooming Police Chief Jeff Potts, who had an important voice and made sure that we were hearing every perspective involved in making our communities safe. And with that, it's my pleasure to bring up Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan.
Hazards of wearing long earrings and a mask here. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really grateful to be here, and I didn't know that we would get here today, but we're here because of the hard work and tenacity of so many folks in the legislature, many of whom are in this room with us this morning. The murder of George Floyd laid bare the injustices a law enforcement system that does not serve and protect all Minnesotans equally. And before George, it was Philando. And before Philando, it was too many names of Black men and women killed at the hands of law enforcement. When George Floyd died, the grief and anger in that moment felt unbearable. So the legislators got to work. There's been a lot of hard work and long nights to get us to this moment, but I'm really grateful to be here, taking the first steps towards meaningful police accountability and reform. And I want to be clear, these are only the first steps. The bill that the governor signed today is not everything that needs and should be done. Our commitment to the people, the families, and communities impacted by police violence does not start or end here today. This is a first step. I'm grateful to the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus in the House and the Senate who led this conversation with persistence and resilience. And I'm going to name each of them. Representative Jamie Becker-Finn, Representative Aisha Gomez, Representative Hodan Hassan, Representative Kwali Hur, Representative Mary Kunish-Podine, Representative Fu Lee, Representative Elise Mann, Representative Carlos Mariani, Representative Rita Moran, Representative Mahmoud Noor, Representative Ruth Richardson, Representative Samantha Vang, Representative Jay Zhang, Representative Tu Zhang, Senator Melissa Franzen, Senator Fong Kerr, Senator Jeff Hayden, Senator Bobby Joe Champion, and Senator Patricia Torres Ray. And I read that long list of names that seems to get larger every couple of years. And I read it because it matters. It matters that the people who are in office reflect the communities they seek to represent. And I also want to just acknowledge the weight of this time and this moment on people of color and Indigenous folks and Black folks in leadership who are caring for their communities, are fighting for justice, while at the same time experiencing the trauma in their own lives. And so the reading of these names of these leaders should not be lost on anyone. Their persistence, their commitment, their passion, and just the personal impact of this work. And I am tremendously grateful to each and every one of them. And with that, I will turn it over to Representative Rita Moran.
Good morning. So I had a speech that I couldn't write, so I asked my media person to do it for me, but it didn't resonate with me neither. This has been a long, I seem long to you guys. Like you might say, it was like 8 days or 2 weeks. This has been a long, drawn-out process for me that filled me with so many emotions. There was many times that I didn't have the patience, didn't have the time, felt overwhelmed, but also stayed in this because it was truly important to me that two things happened, that we have a process that we felt would hold police accountable, and that through that process, we will prevent police brutality of Black men and women, Indigenous, and people of color. And so there was a couple of provisions that I carried in the bill, which was the Chokehold bill and the use of force bill, that allowed me to do one of the things that I believe in, and that is to talk to the people who've been impacted by systems and talk to the people who need to be a part of changing the systems. And that was the police, but also community members. And so I really do want to say I appreciate the moments that I had to engage, that I took time to engage with the Minnesota Association of Sheriffs, the Minnesota Associations of Police Chiefs, and the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, the MPPOA. Never remember what that O is. But I also want to say that this is the beginning of the work that we set out to do. It is not the end. And my biggest disappointment was that we were not able to move on the community side, looking at the families who've been impacted by a loved one who have been killed by those who are there to serve and protect us, the statute of limitations. They deserve their time in court. Whether they win, whether they lose, is not the point. They deserve to have their voices heard in this process. So as we look at the work that we have done, there is still work to do. And I look forward to the opportunity and the time to bring in those three organizations, law enforcement organizations, in a room with those family members so that we can work on a process that gives them a voice within the court system. They have their voices heard in a system that did not allow them because the limitation, the time of getting a conviction or not has made it impossible for them to go any further. So I stand here excited today to thank the governor for this moment, to thank the lieutenant governor for this moment, but also my partner as we was in those negotiations, Chair Mariani, for his strength and his courage and his leadership, and also for the strength and the courage and leadership of our Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to my Chair of Public Safety, Chair Carlos Mariani. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. May 25th was a watershed date for our entire state. On that date, 4 state of Minnesota licensed peace officers slowly, torturously killed George Floyd on a street in Minneapolis in front of citizens who asked them to stop. Their cell phone cameras captured the 8+ long minutes of Mr. Floyd's end of his life as he lay defensively on the street next to a squad car. That video was beamed across the nation and across the world and sparked a righteous outcry of indignation and anger that a society committed to individual liberties and human rights could produce such a monstrous, inhumane act on one of its own citizens and have it perpetrated by the very guardians of our personal safety, the public servants we certify through official governmental professional licensing to safeguard our freedoms. There was no public safety for George Floyd on May 25th. We, the state of Minnesota, his government, horribly failed him on that day. And he was not the first human being, citizen that we have failed. The statistical odds are that we will continue to fail again and again, especially fail Black men and Black women. Black men, as George was, as Philando Castile, a schoolmate of my daughter, was, and so many others, Black, brown, and indigenous Minnesotans. Unless we act now. This legislation is our first and long overdue our first step to act in meeting our primary duty to protect and advance the human rights of all people in our state. The construction of this law and its passage is a powerful acknowledgement of our collective failure in the past, of our failure to these two citizens and countless others who have been wrongfully harmed at the hands of peace officers. We have to start with that acknowledgement. Otherwise, we'll continue to do what we've always done. The bill that I and Chair Moran and Representative Herr and 24 legislators wrote, including authorships from the POCI, the People of Color Indigenous Caucus, and that 102 House members and 60 senators across political party lines overwhelmingly voted for, equips the State Peace Officer and Standards Training Board, the state licensing entity, equips it to act muscularly, unabashedly, to assert the primacy of state law, in the regulation of law enforcement in Minnesota. It is our expectation that they do so, and we will monitor their progress. The law requires the post to develop policies that require every law enforcement unit and individual officer to abide by new standards of use of force and duty to intercede when those are being violated. The law creates a citizen council to inform and guide their actions. Their success in doing that, the Post Board's success in engaging powerfully and fully with regular citizens, will determine whether law enforcement loses or keeps the public's trust. We expect this board to treat that council, to treat those civilian voices as equals and with respect and deference to the wisdom that they will bring to the decision-making table. The law mandates the collection of critical data from all law enforcement units in the state to be centralized at the post and to be analyzed by the council and the board in order to create state policies that modernize our approach to public safety through healthy relationships between police and community, and to identify patterns of behaviors that violate the human rights of Minnesotans and jeopardize the public's trust, so that that board can ensure early intervention and discipline through their licensing power. In other words, to stop the officers who killed George before they even met him. The state of Minnesota does not concede its duty under the Constitution to any other governmental local unit to protect the human rights of its people. We expect that of all local units, but it is our duty as a legislature, as the executive branch, to ensure human rights. The state legislature entrusts law enforcement to be one of our key agents and tool to ensure those constitutional rights are affirmed and realized as we simultaneously deliver the core governmental function of providing for public safety. George Floyd, Lando Castillo, and so many others deserve nothing less. And the Minnesota legislature demands nothing less of itself. I want to thank the POCI Caucus, the members of the House Public Safety Committee. I want to acknowledge Senate Majority Leader Gazelka for negotiating with the House to pass this bill that is heavily shaped by House-proposed legislation. I also want to especially thank Speaker Hortman for her persistence in pushing and pulling us through a difficult agreement process, including helping me to keep my eyes on the prize. And I want to thank you, Governor, for standing with the POCI Caucus, and for insisting that Minnesota values of human decency always be affirmed. Finally, let me say that this is only the first step we must take to bring about a public safety system in Minnesota that actually, truly works for everyone, that can overcome the horrible power of racism, that can create new ways to advance safe communities, that holds wrongdoers fiercely accountable, and that truly sees the inherent dignity of people of color and Indigenous people and each person in our state. There will be more legislation to come. So with that, I want to call up my friend, colleague, and the person who helped me keep eyes on the prize throughout this difficult negotiating process, Speaker Melissa Hortman.
It's been just 8 weeks and 3 days since we lost George Floyd. It's been 4 years and 17 days since we lost Philando Castile, two beautiful human beings whose lives were stolen before our eyes. This legislation is long overdue and yet not enough. It's a critical step forward to preserve the safety of members of our community, but also to preserve the safety of the law enforcement community. These measures will enhance community trust by showing that we're responding to the people who took to the streets and said, no justice, no peace. This is a step forward for justice. I want to call out the specific provisions of the bills and the authors who carried them forward, because this was truly a team effort. It was built on the foundation of Attorney General Keith Ellison and Public Safety Commissioner John Harrington's report on deadly force encounters. Representative Ruth Richardson authored the ban on warrior training. Representative Rena Moran banned chokeholds. Representative Becker Finn required that there's a duty to intercede. Representative Mariani, the visionary voice of conscience in these negotiations, accomplished meaningful reform at the Post Board, including citizen voices and collecting important data that will drive change moving forward. Representative Kali Herr authored the arbitration reform provisions. Representative Moran did really incredible work with the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association in partnership to reform use of force and put sanctity of life at the center. Representative Mariani authored the piece that creates an independent use of force investigation unit at the BCA, which will look at deadly use of force and sexual assault cases intensively. Representative Mahmoud Noor authored the public safety peer counseling debriefing section of the legislation, importantly looking at the mental health of police officers involved in preserving the peace in our communities. Representative Richardson authored two really significant pieces of this legislation, one having to do with mental health training and the other having to do with autism training. The working group on deadly force encounters found that there was a real need for officers to understand autism better. This legislation has the power to save lives. I want to thank all the members who worked on these provisions that were included, but especially call out two pieces that we're going to continue to work on. Representative Sam Vang worked on changing the statute of limitations. It's really critical, as speakers before me have talked about, to give the families their day in court. I was very heartened that Senators Limmer and Gazelka were actually open to this conversation. We didn't get there yet, but that doesn't mean that progress isn't still possible this year. Representative Gomez authored really important pieces to put community voices at each local law enforcement entity, and we'll continue to work to get those community voices heard. So this is a beginning. It's an important step. It's not the end of the journey. Thank you, Governor.
Before we take questions, and I certainly want to be directed to the folks who were instrumental, as we said, for decades working on this, I'd like to take a point of personal privilege to thank the Speaker. I can tell you the most difficult job in politics is to be head of a caucus. You have all of these different interests. Each one of your members comes there with an election certificate and a responsibility to serve their constituents, but trying to build a coalition. You have folks who think that you can just have your idea go and it's your way or no way. It doesn't work that way, especially with caucuses. And the Speaker, and along with Senator Kent and the other caucus leaders, but Speaker Hortman has made that clear, and it's all those difficulties, and then it's the usual herding cats that happens, and then it's also when everybody else thinks they know how to do your job, and you have to interface not only with the other caucuses in the House of Representatives, you have to do that in the Senate, and then you have to interface with the governor's office. I can tell Minnesotans that they can be incredibly proud of someone who puts Minnesota's interests first and foremost and has the skills necessary to navigate and move pieces of legislation through a process that is meant to be very difficult, and I think many people thought that we were going to fail. So having a Speaker with a spine of titanium is certainly helpful, and I, for one, am grateful to have you there. So thank you for that. And I'd also like to take just a moment to thank some folks that aren't here but had a profound impact on me. People like Debbie Montgomery, Margaret Coleman, Yusuf, others, who years ago, when I was a member of Congress or thinking about doing that or thinking about potentially asking the people of Minnesota to give me the privilege of being governor, told me and said, well, since you're a white kid from a farm country in rural America, you need to educate yourself and be with us and see community and learn community. And these are people that opened up their homes and their families. They opened up their churches. I walked hand in hand with Margaret down Selby Avenue for years to the Selby Avenue Jazz Festival. Margaret had me in her backyard for barbecues with neighbors. And those types of personal interactions, those types of trying to understand where everybody's coming from, I feel incredibly privileged that was shared with me. And every time Lieutenant Governor and I get on with families who have lost loved ones, I feel a real sense of responsibility and the trust that they put in by resharing those horrific and traumatizing stories, and they trust us with their stories. They trust us to try and internalize those stories, to try and humanize those stories, and to try and figure out a way to put politics, to put roadblocks aside and actually make meaningful change. So I didn't mention everybody, but to those of you who are out there, please know it made me a better person. It makes me see things differently. And as you heard, those members of the POCI Caucus continue what is an education still for me and I think for many others. And once we see that through others' eyes, we see the common humanity, we get to places like this where we understand that we need to be in community, we need to understand community, we need to have people of community to truly make public safety happen. And with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions, or more importantly, have these folks answer them.
The sheriff or the chief to step up and tell us what you think about this legislation. We heard, all along in this process that this was going to be an attack on law enforcement, and a one-size-fits-all strategy wouldn't work across the state. So I'd like you to get up and say what you think about how this would affect your deputies or your officers.
I'll just take my kind of the first crack at that question. Jeff Potts, Minnesota Police Chiefs Association, Chief of Police from Bloomington. I think it was mentioned by at least a couple of the speakers here that this process has been really intense for the last couple weeks, but that really wasn't the beginning of it. The work that the Commissioner, John Harrington, and Attorney General Ellison put in over the last year, the working group on reducing deadly force encounters really kind of assisted or helped in the process of getting us to where we are today. And so what I'll say on behalf of the Minnesota Chiefs Association, that we're very proud to have been a partner in this with the Minnesota Sheriff's Association and the MPPOA. I think that all of the people who worked on this really leaned into this discussion. It's very serious, but yet a very complex issue. And as a law enforcement representative with the Chiefs Association, we definitely engaged and leaned into these discussions because we know how important and how serious they are. We're proud to have been a partner. Thank you for including us. I think it ultimately led to a bill that all of the associations can support. As you heard already, it was supported by bipartisanly in the House and the Senate. And so while everybody agrees that the work is not yet done, as the representative from the Chiefs Association, we remain committed to continuing with this work throughout this year and into the next session.
Tim Leslie, Dakota County Sheriff, representing the Minnesota Sheriff's Association and the 87 elected sheriffs across the state of Minnesota. I want to thank the governor, Lieutenant Governor, and Speaker Hortman, and of course Chair Mariani for his leadership. Chair Mariani has been steadfast, and we got a punch in the face, and we deserved it, and we're ready to make those reforms that the people have made into law, and we're at the table having conversations throughout the entire time. We'll continue to be at the table, and we want to make sure that we do what the people want, and because we work for the people. So thank you very much.
Can you tell us about conversations with Senate leaders and what the next round of legislation might look like?
I think I'll start with the Speaker on this. As I said, she was instrumental. She was in the room on every single one of these. And Commissioner Harrington might be better able to speak from the administration's perspective because he was negotiating a lot for us. So if the two of them.
Well, the governor's leadership was really instrumental at the moment where he engaged with Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka and got the Senate Majority Leader together with families of the victims of police violence. And that was really moving for Senator Gazelka. And Senator Limmer also, I believe, represents the family of someone who was victimized by police brutality. So I was really surprised in the negotiations, the openness to discussing the statute of limitations. We looked at the priest sex abuse model of having a 3-year open window and a new form of statute of limitations that doesn't begin to start running until the internal investigatory process is over. But that is a very complex legal issue. When we finally acted on that in the legislature in Minnesota, I believe it was in 2013, it was after years of work on the legal standard. We should be able to move faster here, but we just weren't able to move in 8 weeks on that statute of limitations. So that's the one piece I'm really focused in on. The other piece is the community voices. And I think that's something that can start to happen at the local levels. So individual citizens in their communities, whether it's Bloomington or Brooklyn Park or Minneapolis or St. Paul, to have more of a voice at the table involved in looking at what we're expecting of law enforcement and engaging in fulfilling those expectations.
John Harrington, Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety. Pivoting off of the work that the Attorney General and I and the working group on reducing deadly force, there were 28 recommendations that we came forward with. And while we were delighted to see far more of those recommendations in this legislation than frankly any other state has seen, when I talked to my colleagues across the United States, not only was Minnesota the first state to take on reducing deadly force as a statewide topic, but the legislation that was just passed is absolutely leaps and bounds beyond what any other state has done. Most other states banned chokeholds and maybe said there was a duty to intervene or did some regulation on holding police officers accountable. But as you heard the list of really in-depth steps that this legislation takes us, we are much farther ahead than most states are. Having said that, I see some of the post-board reforms that Chair Mariani has put into place. We have talked about the holding police accountable part, and I think the other piece of this that is now open for discussion is how do we train our police officers? How do we train our peace officers? How do we know that the training that we give them, in fact, is meaningful training, and the data that we're going to collect will, in fact, help inform us that the training we're giving them, in fact, changes behavior and enlightens their behavior. We should be able to see that when the training is done, that police officers and peace officers are able to handle deadly force encounters and use of force encounters in a better way, in a way that is more both culturally sensitive, but is also much more effective. In addition to the training piece, I am optimistic to look at issues around body cams and other technology that can help us hold police officers accountable. I believe that as a chief of police of a couple different departments, I loved having the video. I loved having the evidence so that when I had to come forward, whether it was to the post board or to an arbiter to make a decision about whether an officer should continue to be an officer or not, I wanted clear evidence. And so I would love to see us do more work on body cams and how can we use those to make sure that officers are both cleared when they are doing the right thing and then held accountable when they're not.
Yeah, very quickly. I think the speakers already identified some of the next ideas that we want to continue to push on. I just want to say a couple things. One is that in the House, we spent a lot of time interacting directly with community-based groups. We had a number of town hall meetings via the Zoom apparatus. You all know we had a 7-hour key committee hearing where we heard from an incredible diversity of people working at the grassroots level from all communities, from the intellectual community, as well as from law enforcement. And one of the things that struck me, quite frankly, is that once you have that conversation, it's amazing how much overlap there is in terms of issues that need to be addressed. So arbitration was a good one, where we had our chiefs in particular who were really pushing for arbitration reform. At the same time, we were hearing from folks on the street level that were really concerned, where they would observe behavior that was, from their perspective, being condoned as a result of a mediated settlement after the police chief had already taken disciplinary steps toward an individual. So all that by way of saying two things. There is incredible common ground here. There really is. And two, part of that is to make sure that we have a balance in terms of who is at the table. And right now, well, now we've got to change with the law. Community groups are not at the table, by and large. They will be increasingly. You cannot do systems change unless you shift mental models, how people think. And the way one way in which you shift how people think is you have different people interacting with one another and learning and hearing from one another. That's really where our best hope is in terms of devising what those next steps are going to be. We're going to continue our process of engaging directly with community folks, with all sorts of people. We talk to folks that a lot of folks just don't want to talk to because they're too radical, too loud. They throw stones. Yeah, I don't like it. But the point is, you got to be able to have those engagements. There is rich wisdom that can come from all of that. And so we're going to continue that process, and we're going to continue to push out some new ideas in the coming year. Yes.
I think George Floyd's killing, I think, have laid bare the racial disparities that people of color live here daily. We've also seen a rise in racial representation at the State House. How has the POCI Caucus made a difference in responding to both crises, and is it fair to characterize the signing of today's police reforms as the most high-profile legislative victory for people of color in Minnesota?
I would say it would certainly be up there. Race is at the center of this conversation. The statistics are real clear about who disproportionately gets most harmed when something goes wrong, when there is police brutality, including the worst possible outcome. It's going to be Black men and women. It's going to be brown men and women. It's going to be Indigenous people. There's a story that's happening across the state that we're only really scratching the surface at this point. But you have to have people who scratch that surface. And that's what those POCI legislators bring in increasing numbers. So it isn't just me and Rita Moran. It's, a dozen other individuals. As we struggled with how to provide support for communities that were devastated by the worst aspects of the demonstrations, where we had, frankly, a lot of outsiders that came in and trashed and hurt Minneapolis and St. Paul. There's a fierce conversation and pushing and legislative proposals coming from not only people who represent those communities, but people who represent those communities who are people of color. And so they know firsthand, that Asian food store that just got ruined, that Latino record store that just got burned to the ground. They know these communities like family, and so there's that passion, that urgency about right now that brings to the table. I think we should expect our legislature to continue to modernize in that respect, that it's going to become increasingly representative of the true diversity in our state, and with that, there's going to be more issues on the table. But yeah, I would say this is a high watermark relative to the presence of POCI legislators in Minnesota.
Well, I'm not currently a member of the POCI Caucus. I'm a founder, so I'll just speak to this. Ricardo, I just want to also just say, that's the question. I think in many ways, that is the question that has not been asked, frankly, about what difference it makes when there are people who represent communities who haven't been at the table before. And I'm glad that it was asked, because I think with this legislation, it is an example of what happens when we can speak for ourselves. And I think that, frankly, the work around missing and murdered Indigenous women within the legislature was one of the steps before this step as well, of ensuring the safety of people of color and Indigenous folks, but that it is not lost on me that because of the work of Representative Becker-Finn and Representative Kunesh Podine, and the ability to speak directly to folks in leadership like Speaker Hortman and Majority Leader Gazelka, that makes a difference. When you have to see someone personally and look them in the face and see the humanity of the people who are impacted most, it changes things and it changes dynamics. And we are having a whole host of conversations in this moment as we are responding to the violence against Black and Brown people. And frankly, as you mentioned before, the COVID-19 pandemic that has impacted our communities more than others. And so my hope is that this is not a blip on the screen in the history of Minnesota, but is this moment where we see things changing, where we can have those conversations that are long overdue with the people who are most impacted, who haven't been at the table in a really substantial way until very recently in positions of leadership and power.
Well, thank you, everyone. Important work that was started. Grateful again, lots of thanks, but it's first start. Reminding Minnesotans, as of Saturday morning, we'll mask up Minnesota. It'll take us a couple weeks to see in the data lag, but we will make an impact. We will make sure that our children can get back to school and move forward. And I'd like to, again, I think this is on behalf of the Lieutenant Governor in this, that thank the folks at the State Fair for their creative drive-through food thing that has Minnesota extremely excited about what's coming. So let's keep moving in a direction, Minnesota, we can enjoy those types of things, and let's make sure that every Minnesotan feels safe in their community. This legislation will help do that. Thank you. Hetty, can I get those wipes so I can, if you give them to me?